Today we have Professor Bilge Ezel. Bilge is a professor of media culture at the College of Staten Islands and an affiliated faculty member in Middle Eastern Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. She has written extensively on global media, surveillance, state power, and the politics of communication. Today we are here to talk to Bilge about her recent award-winning book, Talking Back to the West: How Turkey Uses Counter-Hegemony to Reshape the Global Communication Order, that was published by University of Illinois Press recently. So without much ado, we can start the conversation. And Bilge, welcome to the show. Welcome to our podcast on global disorder. We'd like to first help us to give a broad understanding of why did you decide to write this book, Talking Back to the West? That's a very intense and interesting title, Talking Back to the West. Why were you interested in this book in the first place, and how did you come about writing it?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I was finishing my previous book, Media in New Turkey, around 2014, 2015. And I started noticing a number of developments that was happening in Turkey's domestic media field, which was mostly about like this burgeoning initiatives from the Erdogan regime about how to promote the country in a positive light to foreign audiences. So I started paying attention to these new developments. In 2015, Erdogan regime launched TRT World, Turkey's first English news channel, 24/7 news channel modeled after CNN International and BBC World. And there was an English newspaper called Daily Sabah that was both in print back then and also available online. Again, this was 2015, happening around the time of important domestic and foreign policy developments. So this was the time of Syrian refugee crisis, a huge influx of Syrian refugees into Turkey, as well as the refugee crisis in Europe. 2015, 2016 was kind of like the aftermath of certain domestic crises, legitimacy crises that put the Erdogan regime and Turkey in a difficult predicament, especially with respect to Western policymakers and international media circles. And by Western, I usually refer to US and Europe. So the Gezi Park protests in 2013 and Erdogan's corruption scandal also in 2013, and then like the Erdogan regime's role in Syrian civil war, the implications of Kurds in northern Syria, right across the border, fighting ISIS, and like Turkey's sovereignty concerns with respect to this new Kurdish political and military presence right across its border, the Obama presidency and its support for the Kurds. So there were like a kind of like convergence of like domestic and foreign policy decisions, events, developments that kind of, I think, propelled the Turkish government to promote itself in a more positive light and also to legitimize its like domestic and foreign policy choices with respect to the foreign audiences. This was also the time when, like the Erdogan regime was also receiving a lot of criticism for its increasing authoritarianism, especially after its like police crackdown after the Gezi Park protests in 2013. So they were doing more and more like these different pillars of the regime were doing more communicative work to address this, what I call the communication crisis. Like, how do we explain Turkey's domestic and foreign policy choices? How do we promote the country in a more positive light? This promotional imperative also was building on the new foreign policy direction that the Erdogan regime has been building since 2010s under the direction of then foreign minister of foreign affairs and then like Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, that like not just attach Turkey exclusively with the Western alliance, NATO and like European Union, but also like go back to Ottoman heritage, Ottoman presence in the Middle East, North Africa, and elsewhere around the world. So it was also the time when, like the Turkish government or the Erdogan regime was beginning to invest time, energy, and money in like development assistance, humanitarian aid across these regions in the Balkans, Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa, and other African countries. So there was also a growing need to appeal to especially Muslim communities in these regions. So it was like convergence of like domestic foreign policy developments that like attracted my attention, but also like as a scholar of media communications working in the United States, I was also paying attention to what was happening on a global scale in terms of the information news and information landscape, because this was the time, especially in the US as well as in Europe, like the emergence of Trump and his movement, like the resurfacing of right-wing extremism in Europe, Brexit, and all these developments, and at the same time, like the rise of these like counter or like rising great powers like Russia, China, and like regional powers, Brazil, India, and Turkey. And this was the time in 2016 when, as in Europe and in the United States, a lot like political communication and like media scholars were intensely focusing on disinformation and propaganda and how much role, let's say, like Russia played in the US elections. They meddled with like social media feeds or like how they affected like the coverage of American politics. There was a lot of attention on Russia today and Russia's like disinformation campaigns, again, real or perceived, right, in the US and in Europe. I also noticed this like changing discussions or new emerging discussions around disinformation and propaganda, right? And so this was like how I started paying more and more attention to what Turkey was doing in the global communication landscape.
It also shows how somebody who is an academic, but also who's aware of the broader trends in the world, and you've covered quite a lot. But as you rightly say, the connection is largely between domestic and the international. We can't keep these as silos anymore, and this is a great start. And the second broad question, continuing for what you just said, is that there are so many things that are happening simultaneously, as you pointed out, from Syrian refugee crises to what happened with Trump suddenly, and the ISIS and Obama and Kurds, and there was the Syrian civil war, domestic corruption. So it looks like poly crises, or effectively everything everywhere all at once. But Turkey, in that instance, and this is not just confined to Turkey, but several other global south states, have decided to put their country in a positive light as a strategic statecraft. What drove that ambition?
Like in 2010s, that's when I start kind of like the story when like the foreign policy was being reoriented and like these multiple crises were emerging in the 2010s. Like that's a long decade, right, for Turkey and elsewhere. I trace the history of all these like public diplomacy, PR, communication, strategic communication efforts. So we can find like earlier examples, and I'm not really going to go into a lot of detail about this, but like the state-run news agency, Anadolu Agency, has its roots back in the like 1920s during Turkey's independence war against Western powers. Then there is Voice of Turkey, was established like the international radio service in the 1930s, and then we have international channels from TRT in the 1990s, and then regional foreign language channels from TRT, like such as TRT Kurdish and TRT Arabic in early 2010s. So these were all like historical examples, earlier examples of Turkey's efforts, right? And then more recently with TRT World and TRT Arabic to kind of like influence the regional politics, right? It's not a coincidence that, like the first foreign language channels TV channels that they launched is in Kurdish and in Arabic, because 2010s is also the time when Davutoglu and Erdogan are trying to establish the country as this like new regional player. I noticed that in the existing literature, Russia's like international communication initiatives such as Russia Today and Sputnik and all the other like social media campaigns were strictly framed as like propaganda, disinformation, misinformation, like weaponization of information. And like the literature on Turkey was mostly about public diplomacy and soft power. And like I looked at the coverage of Chinese efforts, like such as CGTN, the Chinese Global Television Network, and China Radio International. That was kind of like a mix between like public diplomacy or China's going out efforts. So I also wanted to like move away from this framework, and I wanted to look a little bit more deeply into like what really kind of like galvanize or mobilize these attempts on the part of like the state officials and their proxies and like in media in Turkey. So obviously, yes, like these are like part of like public diplomacy, propaganda, or disinformation efforts and whatnot, speaking for like what all states do, right? You will find a little bit of that, I don't know, in Voice of America, like BBC World, CGTN, Russia Today, what have you. But I wanted to also see like the ideological underpinnings of this because as I was around, like I said earlier, when I was finishing my previous book, I was like paying attention to like TRT World, what Anadolu Agency was doing, their journalism training programs all around the world, this new English language newspaper and online like websites, online publications, a lot of like Twitter activity, social media activity in English language from Erdogan government officials. General themes I noticed, right? Such as paying attention to Islamophobia or the decline of the West, or like Western states being engaged in this kind of like imperialistic scheme against Turkey and its sovereignty. That like that rang a bell, right? This has a long history in like Turkish political and cultural landscape. So I started noticing these kind of like echoes from the past. Again, these are not new. So that's why I wanted to like go into the history, the role of identity and like cultural grievances.
Excellent. I think that was very well captured in your book as well. And what your book beautifully does is that it critically interrogates that statecraft, that notion of putting countries in a positive light. And we'll come to some detailed discussions here from now on. But before that, I'm going to ask my colleague Begum to have a follow-up question on this.
Yes, you've mentioned this a bit, but I wanted to ask about the audience as well, and the audience of TRT World in Europe, for example, because when you watch the channel, you see a lot of coverage of progressive politics in Europe and the US, but it's selective, right? So it's not actually covering all progressive politics. So I just was wondering what's your take on that, and who is the audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So let me say a few things about the audience first. When I first started doing like watching TRT World, like when it started broadcasting 2015, 2016, like, and I was talking to my colleagues about this like new English language news channel from Turkey. It had a lot of like former Al Jazeera like people and like very like Western styled like news coverage modeled after CNN International and BBC World. And first, I used to think like, okay, so they're appealing like to Western audiences. But then I thought, in its early days, like there's obviously a lot of promotional coverage about Turkey. How are they going to convince Western audiences about like the wonderful things that Turkey is doing under Erdogan, right? Like everybody knows, right? People who watch this, like the audiences will know that this is a Turkish propaganda, quote unquote. So I always thought like, okay, so the primary audience is the West because it's in English language. And then I started paying more attention to this coverage about Islamophobia and Syrian refugee crisis and whatnot. And then it occurred to me like actually there is like a big audience that they're appealing to, and that's in the global South. So that's why I like titled the book Talking Back to the West. So on one hand, like they're talking back to the West, kind of like showing Erdogan as this like, powerful Muslim leader that can stand up against the Western hegemons, right? And Turkey as this like kind of like big brother of oppressed Muslims around the world. But at the same time, they're appealing to that audience, especially in global South, like Muslims, like oppressed Muslims. So there is that need to rally these audiences, right, under Turkey's leadership. But originally, like this audience, the Western audiences and global South audiences, the content in early days was mostly about like the promotional stuff, how Turkey is treating its Syrian refugees, like how it's fighting against ISIS and like things like that. In recent years, as you've noted, they are like also focusing a lot on like Western politics and social, cultural, political movements, which I also talk about in the book, especially with respect to like the coverage of like far-right extremism in Europe, Islamophobia, and also very critical coverage overall in their documentaries, like short videos on, let's say, like colonialism in Africa, like what did Belgium do in Africa? And there are all these, like you can find a bunch of short videos. So coverage, critical coverage of like all these issues like imperialism, colonialism, environment, far-right extremism, police brutality, like free speech, campus protests, right? These are also the issues that progressive audiences in the West are interested in. But at the same time, while doing that, continue to interrogate like the Western powers and the Western hegemony. I have a colleague who is a Muslim American and like a progressive in terms of her politics. And she said to me, like, she watches TRT World and she finds this like critical content about Western hegemony, imperialism, colonialism, like Western military interventions, very powerful. She said this is very appealing, right? That's like what this channel is doing in a clever way, appealing to these like audiences with progressive political leanings. But this, again, is not specific to TRT World. Russia Today has been doing this for a very long time, especially RT America. So to these audiences, this is appealing as long as they don't know about the history of like the crackdown on academic freedoms in Turkey. So I think that's like if you're familiar with this, with what's happening in Turkey on university campuses, like how there is really no free speech on university campuses in Turkey, then you can like become aware of that like hypocrisy or that duplicity. But for the international audiences in Europe or in the United States who do not know about these domestic politics, then TRT World comes off as this like progressive channels. But as you said, this is also selective because TRT World also like broadcast a documentary that is very anti-LGBTQ. They like had an hour-long program where they interviewed one of their top editors interviewed Andrew Tate. They had like a dinner interview with Andrew Tate for an hour, right? So there is definitely that like selectivity. And I think depending on I think they're still trying to figure out their audience in the West, in Europe, and in the United States. So when opportunities present themselves, such as the Gaza genocides and the campus protests, they're like, okay, like we can like use this to perhaps to appeal to these audiences.
This is excellent. This is extremely helpful because at some point of time, we are actually in the moment of an inflection point, as you rightly say in the book, where progressive ideas are used for realpolitik purposes. And this is not
Mhm.
confined to Turkey, India, Brazil, or any other global South countries are also doing it. So there is indeed a demand for much more critical reflection from across the world, from attentive audience about environmental crises, climate crises, police brutality, problems of war, what is happening with the Western complicity with many of the crimes in the past, and so on. However, this reflection is taken over by really shrewd policymakers in order to advance their sort of domestic agenda. And your book clearly points out that somehow the Gezi protest and then the Erdogan's corruption scandal was an important point that flipped the statecraft towards projecting Turkey in a particular image. So, for some audience who might not know the details about what happened in the Gezi protest, and also even before when Erdogan was the youth member in the Erbakan's MSP, could you give a brief outline about the current conditions or the past conditions that led to the current sort of despair, if you like, from Erdogan's point of view?
I think Gezi protest was a significant turning point for Turkey and the Erdogan regime, notwithstanding the fact that like it was like the biggest like anti-government nationwide protests that Turkey has, I think, ever seen. It was also important because like the authoritarian tendencies of the Erdogan regime that were brewing since like 2008, 2009, in terms of like the crackdown on like journalists, on free press, like changes in the judicial system. These were things that Western policymakers and media circles were not really paying attention to. Like this was kind of like brewing, but I think Gezi protests in 2013 put all of this in sharp relief, right? So that's, I think, when the Western policymakers and media circles started paying attention to like this like rising authoritarianism. It also came like on the heels of Arab uprisings when Turkey was presented as this like model country, quote unquote, the Turkish model, right? That successfully blended Islam, a Muslim democratic country, but also market friendly, neoliberal policies. I also criticized the Western media coverage of Turkey during 2010s, right? This whole label of Turkish model was very misguided to begin with from the very beginning. But I think Gezi protests also open up like Erdogan government's eyes to its like self-presentation, because they were like, I think they were a little bit distraught or frustrated with this negative coverage. It points out to a particular episode when like Turkish state officials and government officials and communication specialists are beginning to think like, what is going on and like how do we fix this?
One question that I wanted to point out and ask some clarification on is this attention that you're paying to identity politics, particularly Muslim identity politics, and the notion of depicting the West versus the Muslim world, and how we have to stand up for the voice for the voiceless. And these three things, identity politics, standing up for the voiceless, and standing up against the West, are important. There is an important red line that goes through them, which is a particular conservatism that drives the establishment. Can you elaborate a little bit on the sources of this conservatism from the Erdogan regime? What is a conservative Turkey for Erdogan look like, as opposed to somebody who might not understand these things from outside? Because Turkey is, for outsiders, a pretty modern, even if there are very strong Islamic tendencies within Turkey, not like a very strong Islamic country. So there is some sort of a conservatism that is very distinct to Erdogan. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think like the red thread that runs through this like identitarian politics and being the voice of the voiceless, and also like interrogating and criticizing the West, that red thread is for me the Muslim victimhood. And this is a very important undercurrent in Erdogan's politics, in his political life, right? Before he worked in like Erbakan's nationalist Islamist political movement in the 70s, 80s. He was a youth member, and then he like rose through the ranks, but also part of this like conservative nationalist Islamist political ideology in Turkey, as I explain in the book, has like kind of its roots in Islamist intellectuals, right? Which again is strongly built on like the idea of Muslim victimhood. There are 3 or 4 important Islamist intellectuals that are writing during the Cold War era, and even before that, like Ottoman intellectuals, Ottoman statesmen, pretty much like using this like the victimhood narrative, right? Or the idea of being attacked or encroached by like Western powers. This again has a very long history. So that like idea of Muslim victimhood is interesting to understand what the Erdogan government is doing currently, both in like addressing the domestic audiences and also the international audiences. And it is both a means of it. I think it fulfills several functions at the same time. One, Erdogan and like other AKP officials can tell domestic and international audiences that like the West has always encroached on Muslim sovereignty. They have always been racist towards Muslims and whatnot, because this is like who they are. Erdogan says this is the West, right? You cannot change this. He talks about this in like about Srebrenica massacre, about the Gaza genocide. So it helps, I think, them to paint the West as this like inherently and essentially Islamophobic, homogenous, right, actor. And as we know, like obviously that there is a lot of heterogeneity in among Western polities. So it's kind of like boiling down to like binary reductions, East versus West, Muslims versus West, and then neatly packaging each side as like good, the evil, moral, immoral, just, unjust, right? So there is, I think, a missed opportunity there because, as we know, like these things are not that neat, right? Yes, there is rampant Islamophobia in the West and like so many other issues that like we cannot argue against. And it's like definitely like using this populist discourse, right? Us versus them. And then it's as like the voice of the voiceless, as the voice of these like Muslim victims, right? Um, there is something important that Erdogan government is doing. It is also establishing a hierarchy among Muslims, right? So in this case, Turkish Muslims, right, or this like Turkey as a Muslim power is kind of the active, the strong, the powerful one that can give voice to the others, right? So Turkey as a Muslim power has agency, but other Muslim countries or other Muslim communities do not, right? So there's a kind of like hierarchical the hierarchy that Erdogan is establishing here.
That is really, really interesting. In some ways, the victimization narrative is, as you also point out, this is not confined to Turkey as well. Much of China's engagement in the world draws from its sort of history of appropriating history on its humiliation, particularly drawing from the Opium War, and India's recent foray into the notions that India's Indian civilization, in other words, Hindu civilization, was taken over by the Muslims, and somehow we have to redeem the Indian civilization back. And Brazil as the victim of American imperialism, and to some extent, Brazil's underdevelopment can be pretty much pinned down to the sort of the American empire, and that is how we were not able to become the grandeza or the big state. So effectively, there is something about other global South states as well, instrumentalizing this victimhood. And you, in your work and in your discussion, also quite interestingly point out the problems of this essentialization, the us versus them discourse, and kind of using the West as this one big box against which we have to fight. And the point which I want to follow up on, which you briefly mentioned in this discussion, but quite extensively in the book as well, to some extent, Turkey is talking as articulating the voice for the voiceless. In other words, they are becoming the self-professed leader, and no voiceless member, for example, in that community have asked for Turkey's support. In other words, the sort of agency and the hierarchy of agency among Muslim countries that you pointed out, this might be relevant for other countries such as India, which wants to be the leader of the global south, and China, which wants to be the leader of the global south. In other words, there is an internal competition among many of these rising powers, so to speak, to compete for the leadership position. And how, based on your understanding, is this use of Islamist thinkers in Islamic ideology enables the Erdogan regime to establish this hierarchy within the Muslim world? And how does the Erdogan regime sees this hierarchy? Who is on the top? Where is Turkey's role in that hierarchy? And who is in the bottom rungs of the Islamic hierarchy, so to speak?
Yeah, about this like hierarchical relationship between Turkey and world's Muslims and this like leadership or like the quote unquote big brother of oppressed Muslims or the benevolent guardian. Again, I'm using all of these in quotation marks because these are the talking points from the regime. This again is not new. So Turkey, like for a very long time, has been like trying to be the regional power in the Middle East, and like Turkey has also like a kind of like tried to assume the leadership of world Muslims in competition with Saudi Arabia and Iran, right? So this is not new. But what Turkey has, what is new is like they are kind of like going beyond like Middle East, right? So there is more attention paid to like Muslims in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of work in like Turkey is doing in like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and like Bangladesh. And also Muslim majority countries in Africa and the Muslim majority countries in the Balkans, right? So this is new, this is the global leadership of world Muslims. And I think what the Erdogan regime is deploying here is the Ottoman imperial legacy and the heritage, right? So this idea of the great empire that collapsed because of like Western imperialist schemes, not because like the Ottoman military officials like made terrible decisions by like joining Germany in World War I. That history is completely erased, right? So this imperial legacy is a very useful tool for Erdogan and other Turkish state officials to appeal to like Muslims in different parts of the world. And I think in this regard, it's kind of like similar to what Russia and China are doing. There is this great work by Nora Fisher, and I like reference her work in my book. Like these are like three great empires, right? That once were humiliated by the West because they lost like they suffered political setbacks, like or like lost military battles, or were just like economically inferior to Western powers. So she uses the term moral injury to explain like where these once great empires are again trying to invigorate that greatness, that imperial legacy. So like the way, of course, China and Russia are doing this is like different from what Turkey is doing. In the case of Turkey, like Islam plays a huge role to be able to speak to these polities like in the Balkans, Africa. There is a very specific focus on sending humanitarian aid or partaking in like development assistance or journalism training programs in predominantly Muslim majority countries. So that's very selective, that's very intentional. So this is not just like Turkey as a great humanitarian actor. Universally, it's like selectively humanitarian. So it's also as if presenting like Ottoman Empire as quote unquote the good empire, right? So when I watch Turkish historical dramas for this book, like there is this clear attempt to project that imperial legacy in very altruistic and benevolent terms. It's as if when you look at the overall theme of this global communication apparatus, from news to information to popular culture, you see this thread that like casts like the Western empires as like evil empires. Look at the history of colonialism and Western imperialism. Then we have this like the good empire, right? The benevolent empire, and that is like the Ottoman Empire, and like Turkey is now is reviving that legacy.
So I was curious if you see certain parallels between Turkish, Russian, and maybe Chinese uses of, again, Western crises or the hypocrisy of the West to legitimize their own orders. So maybe some of the parallels you see in these different cases. And also, you both mentioned how actually these actors are trying to gain some leadership roles in the global South as well. So maybe there is also that dimension to it.
I have not done a comparative study myself looking at the coverage of RT, CGTN, and TRT World. So let me say that like at the beginning, but I have looked at literature that has examined like RT and CGTN coverage of political, economic, or social cultural crises in the West, especially after 2016 with the rise of like far-right extremism or racial justice protests in the United States, George Floyd protests, or the presidential elections, and like election of Trump. So these are like kind of important episodes that both RT, CGTN, and TRT World paid attention to, right? But they have done it in different ways. There is great literature on RT, especially one by Ilya Yablokov, where he rightfully directs attention to how RT uses like kind of like these conspiracy theories, right, to cast US foreign policy in certain ways. And there is also literature on RT's coverage about racial justice protests, especially George Floyd protests in the US, and how, for example, they label US as this like declining democracy, as a democracy that is in tatters because of like these racial justice issues. CGTN also covered these issues, but like Chinese global communication initiatives come from a different standpoint, so to speak. There is something called a constructive journalism in all of like China's global communication efforts. So they're spending more time to present China as like, look at all the political economic crisis in the West and look how well China is doing. So that's their, I think, brand, right? So yes, all these like rising powers, regional, global, they're all paying attention to these like poly crises in the West, right? From, I don't know, homelessness to far-right extremism to like political turmoil, racial injustice, police brutality, and whatnot. But they're all doing it from like different perspectives. But of course, like there is definitely that kind of like interrogation of Western political and moral leadership and kind of like using that as an opportunity to present oneself, to present that country as kind of like this new candidate or this new potential leader in a perhaps like in this new like emergent multipolar world.
Yes, and that is a very interesting point about multipolarity, which you're bringing up, which is effectively when a state becomes slightly powerful, economically stronger, the idea that it has to get an image or project a particular image and also receive the reputation for being a particular country is very much present in Turkey for a long time, that Erdogan has capitalized. One theoretical point which I would like to ask is the notion of truth that you also point out in your book, and quite effectively, that there is certain truth in what is happening in the attacks, what Turkey is able to show, or even China or India, Brazil, or any other country are able to talk about the West. But your concern, and quite rightly so, is that it is not done in a nuanced manner. It is done in a pretty much black and white manner in order to get or secure political capital to advance the regime's sort of survival and to establish the increasing clawing authoritarianness of these countries. Now, there is also at the same time, having that into account as one premise, the second premise is that Turkey also wants to engage with the global communication apparatus, which is including engaging with UN and other global norms and institutions. So, and there are many global audiences who might be able to understand this sort of tricks and trades. And Erdogan, like Modi or Xi Jinping, is often used in tandem when they talk about global authoritarians. So there is a group of global liberals, if you like, who are able to understand this statecraft or the strategy of Turkey. So, how do you reconcile these two tensions? On the one hand, the tension is Turkey is able to say that it is talking truth effectively, but not in a nuanced manner. But it also wants to create a global communication apparatus that works with global norms, rules, and institutions where there are members who kind of know that these are authoritarians. When they talk to Erdogan or Orban, they might have a diplomatic conversation, but effectively they come with an understanding that these are authoritarians effectively doing it to consolidate their regime. So, how is Turkey able to manage this tension?
So in the book, I talk about this strategy that they're using, and I call that strategic obfuscation to direct attention to this pattern of like highlighting certain truths and facts that are undeniable, that you cannot argue against. Yes, colonialism is a reality, Islamophobia is a reality, like no one can argue against those. But as you said, while they are like talking about these truths and facts, they are being selective, right? So the facts that work to the Erdogan regime's advantage or kind of help him to promote his particular message in that instance are highlighted, right? And others are just brushed away. A good example of this is like the coverage of Islamophobia and also like official statements and generally the state narrative from the Turkish state on Islamophobia in the West, right? So as we know, like Islamophobia is not just a Western problem, right? But if you watch like TRT World or if you pay attention to Erdogan's official statements, yes, there is some acknowledgement of it as being like a universal problem, but there is like this very disproportionate focus on the West, right? So from official statements to the state narrative to the media coverage, there is like that particular attention to Islamophobia in the West, where, for example, there's really no mention of the Muslims like predicament in China or like Islamophobia elsewhere. There is like also focus on like Kashmir and India. So like the attention on Islamophobia, I think, is a good example of the strategic obfuscation. And also like it is a good example because, as you mentioned before, like it is boiled down to this essential inherent thing in the Western quote unquote character, right? That's the Western identity. That's the term that Erdogan often uses. So when you just boil it down to this like essential identitarian thing, you're also like overlooking like other factors that give rise to Islamophobia. Right? Yes, like Islamophobia is basically like racism, right? But there are also other political, economic factors that kind of, make it like even more rampant, especially in Europe, like the far right extremism. Like this has to do with like the economic conditions, the collapse of like neoliberal order, right? The economic precarity, migration, and like all other related issues that have to do with like I don't know, like labor markets or cultural issues or like social integration and all of that, right? When you like overlook all these like set of like complex and factors, right? That kind of like give rise to Islamophobia, and you just boil it down to us versus them, or it's because like they hate Muslims, right? Which is very, very simplistic. Um, I mean, you cannot argue against that, right? So I think that's the clever tactic, right? This obfuscation of like a whole host of like complex factors, and just like boiling it down to like us versus them. It also helps Erdogan to kind of like keep this idea of like this Muslim victimhood alive, right? Because like this goes back to your question about reconciliation of these two like contradictory things. Like there's all this talk about like Turkey as being this like great power, like this rising power. It is like, I don't know, like the leader in defense industry, and Turkey is doing great in like so many different realms. But then how come it's still like a victim, right? So it also helps to keep that fire burning, if you like, right? Oh, because like they hate us and they will continue to hate us, right? It's just because we're Muslims. So this is also like kind of like a reversal of like Huntington's civilizationist paradigm. So this again like looks at like which civilization or like which nation or which culture is like better than the other.
So Begum and I were talking about reading this book, and we were reading it from our own independently, looking at this, and so many things to talk about. It has a lot of things to show. And students are going to appreciate it because this is something that we effectively not have in the classrooms as well. I mean, many students know the CNN effect immediately, but effectively other countries like Turkey are also doing the same game.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like speaking of CNN effect, there's also like what communication scholars have referred to as Al Jazeera effect,
Yeah.
right? Since its launch in the Middle East, and then with Al Jazeera English, like in the global communication landscape, like bringing the voice of the Middle East into the global communication environment and like challenging the typical representations of the Middle East, right? So I think in that regard, TRT World is also doing that. And when I interviewed some of their executives, they clearly said, yes, we are seeing this channel as a competitor to BBC World, CNN International, and Al Jazeera English. The executive who did the entire launch of the channel, like the general structuring, he was like hired from Al Jazeera English in Doha.
This is interesting because in some countries like India, for example, where I come from, the notion of media is now taking over completely. It's taken over by the state, and everybody is sort of like, if you watch Indian TV channels, my God, there are 10 people standing in the screen and shouting at each other, and no one will
Yeah.
make sense of what's going on. But there is a steady stream of fund that actually says we have to talk against the West. We've been like circulating Western narratives for a long time. We have to go back to the indigenous civilizational roots and asking questions. So media.
What they're also doing is, and I talk about this in the book, how they're using kind of like this post-colonial language, right? So yes, there are certain like, I don't know, like examples of global South media and communications that can be celebrated for their counter-hegemonic like potential. But not everything is worthy of celebration. Yeah. So I think like people are thinking like, oh yes, like look how like China is now challenging the West, or look how Turkey is challenging the West. I've had like grad students in my class last year when I was talking about this, and they saying like, "Oh, I watched TRT World. That's a great channel. They're like doing a great job with like Gaza and the genocide." And then they said, "But I had no idea it was a Turkish channel."
Yeah.
And I think this is because like it's like so closely follows that like visual style and grammar of CNN International and like
Yeah.
Al Jazeera English. So it hides its like sponsor.
Finally, just a quick sort of point. Do you have any advice for young researchers, new PhD students who are working on Turkey, Turkey's foreign policy, or the Islamic world, or on the global South in general, and questions on communicative orders, international relations, foreign policy, public diplomacy, and how things are changing? Do you have any advice for them on how to proceed, particularly in terms of engaging with something really interesting and intricate, such as your project?
Um, Thank you for your kind words. My advice would be to be interested in history and culture, right? So yes, there are all these like communicative initiatives at present, like a lot of contemporary developments that could be the starting point for like a project. It was in my case, but I would advise them to look beyond these dominant paradigms and to go beyond that like presentist angle and look at history and also culture, because like foreign policy, international relations, these are not just about like public diplomacy or soft power or like foreign policy, but they're also about culture, about these like sociocultural vestiges that have been that are interlinked with like deep undercurrents, right? So that would be my advice. This is not to say that like works that are about contemporary developments about foreign policy or international relations like are not worthwhile. They are definitely, but I think it's important to look to go beyond the dominant paradigms, right? Yes, we are all like paying attention to the dominant paradigms, right? Um, and we are like making a contribution to that literature, but what is missing from that dominant paradigm, right? What do we not see, right, when we are so like engrossed in that dominant paradigm? I think that would be an important question to ask oneself, right? What am I missing, right? What am I not looking at?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bilge. It was really an interesting conversation, and we did learn a lot, and we were able to use your ideas and help us think about several different things that are going on. So thank you very much.